Hi guys, it's Brooke here. I have a super quick favor to ask. When you have a moment, please take just a second to give this podcast a 5-star review. This will help me to continue the podcast and continue to bring these resources to the community. Thank you so much for that 5-star review.
The minute you throw a kid out of your classroom and send them to the principal's office, you've made the problem worse because now your classroom is dangerous, right? And this is a place that a kid has been excluded or thrown out. They go down and they regulate in the principal's office and they get calm and they have a conversation where the principal's talking to them as opposed to talking to Harold and Bob. But they walk right back into a context that doesn't have conflict resolved, and then they escalate again. And then it just becomes this revolving door.
Hey there, it's Brooke, and welcome to Finding Hope on the Spectrum, where I have heart-to-heart conversations with parents, professionals, and autistic individuals sharing personal insight and life experiences. Together, we dive deep into supports, programs, and stories that offer inspiration, insight, and most importantly, hope for the neurodiverse community. Before we begin with today's topic, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And if you know someone who this would be helpful for, please pass it along. Remember to always stay curious, be kind, and have an open heart. All right. Well, I'm excited to introduce our host today. Today on Finding Hope on the Spectrum, I'm joined by Lisa Riegel, educator, consultant, speaker, and author of 3 books focused on brain science, behavior, and creating inclusive systems that work. Lisa's journey began in the classroom and led her through school leadership, doctoral work in education, and consulting at the district and state level. What sets her apart is how she translates complex brain science into practical, compassionate tools for educators, parents, and students. Her mission is simple but powerful, that we can all be healthy, happy, and successful. And it starts with understanding the brain, supporting regulation, and building systems that adapt to people, not the other way around. So I'm so excited for this conversation, and welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, let's start off with just talking about the experiences that led you to this work and what you're doing today.
Sure. So when I was a teacher, I started out, I had an amazing staff, amazing leader, and then that leader left and we went through a series of really bad leaders. And then I left and became a school leader myself and did some work in administration, working under somebody who was a very ineffective leader. And so I went to Ohio State to study leadership, and I was interested in the human side, in, human engagement. And in the classroom level, teachers talk about student engagement all the time. And there's, education should be a people system, but we've moved away from that. So I got interested in the social science work around motivation and engagement and those kinds of pieces. And then I realized real change starts in the brain, and there's a whole lot of biology going on as well. So I thought, you know what, I should know about that. And once I opened that can of worms, I realized that, wow, this is stuff that really everybody should know, because it gives you a lens through which you look at your relationships and your behavior and your work that can be so much more self-aware and self-regulating. You have more self-control when you understand how your brain works. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of become my mission to bring that information to people who work with really anybody. I mean, I work in business or in schools, but just people who work with people to help them have better experiences and more fulfillment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so great. And we're going to talk a lot about how you work on that and how you educate children in particular on how the brain works and how empowering that is. And so I'm excited to get to that point of our conversation. And was there a moment, you just kind of described these leaders that you had? And it's funny, my sister's an educator too, and she's told me over the years about the leaders and the struggles, and she's an administrator. And so I can completely kind of picture these kinds of stories and from talking to her over the years. And just curious, is there a moment when you realized that these systems needed to change?
I think I always loved the at-risk kids. And so I think even from the time I started, I realized that the systems were not built for them. Mm-hmm. And so I tried to create a classroom that was very we're a community, we're working together. And I never had behavior problems in my classroom. I mean, in 9 years, I think I sent a kid out once, and that was it. And I looked around. One of the other pieces was when I was at the high school teaching and I watched the different leaders come in. I watched my colleagues who I respected greatly, who were so good at their jobs and so child-centered, and we just did what had to do for kids.
Yeah.
And then under different leadership, I just watched them turn into this whiny bunch of people who hated their jobs and didn't want to do anything. And I would just was like, wow, we've lost the humanity in this system, and it's impacting these people professionally, and they weren't happy, they weren't fulfilled, they weren't serving kids the same way that they had been doing.
Yeah.
So I think it was just a combination of multiple sort of in your face aha moments where I was like, boy, this is really not human centered.
Yeah. Yeah. And to have that contrast, really kind of brought it to life.
Yeah, because I couldn't blame it was the people, right? Because I watched the people go in this descent, and some of them have retired, but a lot of them are still hanging in there, and they hate it. They hate their jobs, and it's just very sad.
Yeah. And that's a trickle effect when that happens.
Yeah.
When they're
Well, and I think the other thing that was kind of an aha moment for me was my journey with my son, because he is what they call twice exceptional. So he's like super, super smart, but he has really bad ADD, and school was just not built for him. And I watched him really like his self-identity of who he was as a student and his, just frustration, and school became a very toxic place for him.
Yeah.
And I just thought, man, if they understood his brain,
Yeah.
then it could be different. And even when we went through an IEP with him, and I was asking about the data that was in the evaluation report, and nobody could tell me what the data meant. Nobody could tell me what the different aspects, the different metrics they use. Nobody could. And then I said, well, what did he have to do on the test that scored low in this area? They couldn't tell me. And I was like, so we're solving a problem we can't even define.
Right.
And that doesn't make sense to me. So I started really digging into executive functioning and how we measure that and what that means and how it's developed. And I was like, this is not hard if you know the brain science behind it. And so that's what I love when I work with teachers and the light bulb goes on and they're just like, oh. And I'm like, because you don't need another curriculum. You don't need another class. It needs to be infused in the way that you run your school and the routines in your classroom. And you will develop, emotional regulation and executive function through that, as opposed to having separate programs.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, I definitely want to get into that as well. Actually, this week I'm releasing an episode on executive functioning from a professional that has specialized in that. So that is definitely something that is so important in our field to talk about and to be aware of. And so we'll definitely want to touch on that for sure. And I'd love for you just to share kind of what your core mission is, given all these experiences you've had and where you are today. You've come so far from even those initial experiences that you had, and we're going to dive into what you offer. But what would you say your core mission is?
I think my core mission is to help people be happy and healthy and successful. And whether that's, a principal or a teacher or a kid. And I just think that we have a lot of power. We get to choose. And if we know that we choose to be happy and we choose to be fulfilled, it's an easy choice. It's a simple choice.
Yeah.
It's not an easy path, but it's much, much easier to do that and to train your brain to be in its optimal form so it can be happy, healthy, and successful if you understand how it's working.
Right. Yeah. It just makes sense. It's really common sense.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing we don't learn about it. I mean, we learn about all our other parts and pieces, and, we learn basics about the system. And when you get to like your whole nervous system in your brain, it's just kind of like, yeah, there's nerves. Move on.
I know.
Have a brain. That's it.
No. It's so true. It really we need a huge shift in our society of understanding the nervous system and how people operate. And, I've learned so much over, having guests on this podcast about that topic and variety of different focus areas. But it is so true. Why children don't learn this in school and what a value it would be to have this be a part of a regular classroom setting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now I know your first book you wrote is Stop Doing What Doesn't Work, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that book. What is that book all about and what inspired you to write it?
So I wrote way back in like 2008. I wrote a book called No Parent Left Behind. And when I was teaching, I always had good relationships with the parents because I was working with kids that I needed to coordinate with the parents. But a lot of my colleagues did not. They just sort of kept parents at an arm's length. And I was like, parents are kind of important to make sure, you need to work as a team. So when I put out Stop Doing What Doesn't Work, it was kind of the next version of that. And it includes all kinds of work that I've done with schools to help in their communities, help build, bridges with parents, help create parent engagement where you have a true partnership. Because I think a lot of times in schools, it's not a partnership, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
But a partnership, both people have power and both people gain something from being in the relationship. And so in schools, I think a lot of our parent engagement is not set up that way.
Yeah.
But when we engage the parents and we work together, we create a context where kids will apply what they learn in one context in the other. And we can provide some consistency and celebration over time to help the kid feel good about their successes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is so significant, especially for the special needs community, just
Right.
how it's so complicated to be a parent and navigate the IEP system and process and understand it. And then to not have a meaningful relationship with a teacher can be really challenging. So it's
well, and a lot of kids with special needs, they need that consistency. I mean, we all do to learn, but it can be super dysregulating for them when they have certain things that work at home and then they're not allowed to do them at school or, and I know even with my son, I felt like you're calling me and, speaking the obvious. So he was a wanderer. He would leave the classroom and go to the bathroom for 45 minutes. And they would call me and be like, yeah, he left. And I'm like, okay, like what, number one, what do you want me to do about it?
Right.
And number two, what are you doing about it? You can't tell me he's the first kid who's been disengaged and wandered the hall. Like, so how do we address this? So it's very frustrating. And I had my daughter was ill, very, very ill in high school, and we didn't really know what was going on. So she'd missed a lot of school. And I emailed her teachers. I was like, put out, let's work together, because she was very anxious and she's a good student. So she was worried about everything.
Right.
And she was not, they were thinking she could have a brain tumor. I mean, it was serious stuff. And I emailed all of her teachers at the high school just to let them know what was going on. And I got 2 emails out of all of them back. Half of them, they didn't even respond.
Wow.
And I had 1 email that was kind. The other one was all business. And I was like, wow. So yeah. So the Stop Doing What Doesn't Work is really about like, let's be people. Let's like work together. Let's recognize that when something's not going well for a kid, first of all, it's terrible for the parent because the parent's worried and, you're never happier than your saddest child. And then let's also figure out how do we make parent engagement easier for teachers as well. And one of the things I say in the book is schools have to have parent policies, because I've had it happen to me. You open your door up for parents and you can open your door up to complete crazy, right? You can open your door up to assault, to verbal abuse, to all kinds of things. So like, I think there's a lot of teachers that are just like, I deal with conflict all day. I don't want to deal with this.
Yeah.
And so having supportive environments from the leadership level to say, how do we make sure teachers feel safe in working with parents?
Absolutely. And I think that's what you bring in, because you have both sides of your experience. And I think that's what makes it so significant, that you can understand the perspective on both ends and, try to bridge that gap, because it is complicated. And
a quick story too. A school hired me because the parents were coming in and assaulting the teachers. So they had to close the doors, but it's an elementary school. So you want parents to be in and out. So they were kind of in a mess. And so we ran a thing called Find Your Voice, which was for parents. They came in, we gave them breakfast. I had people from the community come in, like somebody from the hospital, on how to get a primary care physician, just some things like that. And this was a very high poverty, like deep urban school. And so I was talking to the administrators and I said, the people who you serve, your families, do not have strong relationships with institutions. They are not treated with respect. They don't know how to navigate those systems. They don't have the social capital. So we went through and did this whole series on find your voice and, what do you want out of this partnership and how do you ask it? And I partnered up parents so that they could work with each other to help support each other. And it was amazing. And they, I'd hear them in the parking lot. They'd be like, oh, you got to find your voice before you go in there, and they'd coach each other. And things started to change for the better for their children because they learned how to navigate the system. And they also learned how to regulate their bodies when they were angry.
Yeah, that's huge, right? I mean, that is, I would say that's such a phenomenal approach to that challenge.
Yeah. Well, and it's like the mama bear syndrome. Like, if you think your kid's being wronged, you'll hurt somebody, you come ready to go. And so figuring out how to help them, calm that part down and figure out how to be more strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's huge. And I want to make sure we talk about kind of sensory experiences as well and your take on sensory experiences and how they shape behavior and perception.
Sure. Yeah. So my next book was NeuroWell, and NeuroWell goes through all of this. So people who are interested in the brain science piece, it's in there. But a lot of people understand the stress system. We have a limbic brain. Like a lot of people kind of get the basics of that. But what I think is really important is understanding how our perceptions are perceived. And so we basically have, like, I talk about the brain as like a giant company, and it's got all different departments. And so you've got, just like Amazon has fulfillment and customer service and IT and things like that. We have these different departments. You and me, our personality, our character, our morals, we're the boss, and we live in the prefrontal cortex. When we have perceptions of what's going on around us, that's in our limbic brain. And 80% of the thinking that our brain does is unconscious to us. So there's a whole lot of processing going on that we don't have access to in the CEO's office. So the thalamus is it's like a data manager, and I call the thalamus Harold. And Harold's job is to look in the environment and take in all the sensory information, sound, sight, smells, taste, everything. And then the other thing he does is he receives reports from vagus, which is your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs down your neck, around your heart, around your stomach. It's responsible for two things. It's a systems manager. So it's responsible for your internal systems, and it's also responsible for where is your body in space. Because if I'm standing next to a cliff, I could fall off. So my body needs to be prepared for that danger. Kids today have really low proprioceptive input, and they end up with a lot more sensory needs because essentially they don't know where their body is in space. And so rubbing and touching and doing sensory things sends messages to that vagus nerve that says we're calm, we're okay, and calms down that stress. So Harold takes the information from the vagus nerve and then also from just our senses. But what he does is he just looks for sensory associations. This moment is like that, because if every new experience was novel, our brains would explode. So we have to kind of group them together. Right. So he looks at, I'm in a big wide open space. Okay, let me go through my filing cabinet of all the other times, like big wide open. How do I feel? And the important thing to remember that I think is part of the reason why we misconstrue behavior's intent is that limbic part of our brain doesn't have access to episodic memory. It doesn't have an access to a story. It's just making sensory associations. And then what he does is he writes up a report, sends it to the security center, who I call Bob. So he sends it to Bob. Bob reads it and says, okay, do I just tap the panic button? And if I just tap it, then a message comes up to the CEO's office that says, hey, Brooke, you might want to weigh in on this. We're not really 100% sure how we should respond. If he wails on that button, the message comes up and says, Brooke, go get a cup of coffee and get out of the building. We're under bomb threat. We'll take care of it. When it's safe again, we'll call you back. And so a lot of the behaviors that we see in students, it's Harold and Bob that are directing the behavior, but we correct that behavior and we treat that behavior as if it's coming from the CEO's office. And the other thing that's important with the perceptions is that each of those associations between your external stimulus and your emotion is like a filter. So think of like a screen or a filter. So reality of what's going on in a situation is like a banana. Take the banana and shove it through the filter, and on the other side, it doesn't look like a banana anymore. So helping kids to understand that your perceptions are not reality. Your perceptions are your sensory associations of similar things that are currently happening in reality as compared to all those things from the past. And so I think by understanding that, you can gain some self-awareness so that you can tell your brain, because the goal is, I always say, you want self-awareness first, self-regulation, and ultimately self-control. So like for me, time was always something that made me really anxious. And I know where that comes from. That filter was built because my dad was always late. I spent hours sitting on the porch, and my little 8-year-old brain put love and worth and connected that to time. And that became a filter in Harold's filing cabinet. So when people were running late, way into my 20s and early 30s, I would just be so mad and anxious and just out of sorts. And sometimes it would ruin my whole evening. And so once I understood that association, I was able to say, hey, Harold, decouple that. Those two things, that's a faulty sensory association. And I think that's what we see with kids is that the sensory environment is being associated wrongly in their brain. And so things are stressing them out and triggering them.
Yeah.
And by understanding that, they can decouple those.
Yeah. Fascinating. I love that explanation. And I'm so curious to hear how you recommend to help them. I'm guessing you kind of go through that explanation and maybe also speak a little bit more about the book and how the book is structured. Curious,
Sure.
how that I haven't seen the book yet, but I definitely want to get the book. It sounds fascinating. But how do you work on that with kids, and how did you structure that support in the book?
Yeah. So the book itself, the first part of the book goes through really an examination of all those filters, because our behavior is always the intersection of biology and context. So I just talked a little bit about the biology, but the context shapes the biology because it creates those sensory associations that our brain then uses to determine our reality. So the first section of the book talks about a lot of the contextual factors that are going on today, from media consumption to social media to technology to parenting styles to the medical industry, all different contexts that we live in that are presenting problems for kids because they're creating negative associations that make the kids see the world as chaotic or dangerous or people as untrustworthy or whatever. It's having negative impact on their mental health. The second section goes through the brain biology in a lot more detail than we did here. The third is setting up, how do you set up in schools a NeuroWell culture, a culture that is based in brain science, that is safe, supportive, and proactive so that kids can thrive there. Yeah. And then the fourth is, how can we influence that in the home with parents? How do we help parents build that culture in their home? And so when I work with kids, and I've worked with kindergarten all the way up to adult students, I tell them the story of their brain. And then with the little ones, I'll have them name their brain parts. So I say, my guy's named Harold, introduce me to yours. And then they introduce each other to the parts of their brain, and, their security monitor and their systems manager. And if they're little, I even let them draw pictures, draw your person. And then we talk about the banana, and they all get that. You can shove a banana through a colander and they can see that it's different. Yeah. And then we do an activity called Name It, Own It, Control It, which is it helps them to understand how they experience stress. Because I tell them, if the CEO of your brain is having a cup of coffee somewhere, or if they're little, like an ice cream somewhere or whatever, then they're not there to really understand what's happening in the body. They only come back when it's safe. So let's talk about what's going on in your body. And so we, instead of saying, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? Because they're not, you say, what's your body feel like? And we talk about, do you get hot? Do you get shaky? Do you get a lump in your throat? Does your heart pound? Those kinds of things. And we write those down. Then we say, what does your body look like? And that's always interesting. I actually did this with a group of teachers, and the one teacher was like, I don't know what I look like. And the other one was like, I do. She said, when you get stressed, your eyebrows disappear up into your bangs. She was like, really? So So we do like, what do you look like? Which is a great visual cue for teachers then to recognize this is a stress behavior and not a choice. And then the third question is, what is your brain telling you? So what is Harold telling you is going on? And so we write out those things, and then we have a column where what can I do when I'm starting to feel this way? And so we talk about some of the vagal nerve and sensory exercises you can do to calm your vagus nerve. We talk about some breathing exercises. We talk about, other things they can do, like if there's some teachers have like a little space where kids can get up and kind of pace, or maybe you need to go to the bathroom and get a glass of water or whatever. So we come up with that.
Yeah.
The third column is, what should your teacher do? And then the fourth is, what should she not do? And that helps to prevent that escalation. So that name it, own it, control it becomes kind of a social contract of like, you honor me, that sometimes I'm not okay, and that you're going to create that context that's supportive so that I can calm myself down and not have additional worries that you're going to get mad at me and I'm going to get in trouble.
Right.
And so that's something we do. The other thing I do is it's called Fizzy or Flat. And I take kids outside with a can of pop and shake the pop and then open it up and it blows up everywhere. And I say, we're just like that. We're all carbonated, but I can't see in your can. So just like too fizzy pop is gross, flat pop's gross. We want to be just right. If you come into the classroom and you're feeling fizzy, just say fizzy. And I'm going to give you some grace and space for you to do the things that you do to calm your body back down. And then when you're ready to join, you can join. Or you can come in and say flat. And so it gives students a little bit of voice and agency to say, hey, everybody has a bad day and that's okay. And I'm here to make sure that you have what you need to calm your body down and be ready to learn.
Yeah.
And then, you can keep data on the kids. If you see that like they're coming in after music class every time and they're really escalated. Okay, what's going on in that context that we need to, because the behavior is context specific. So, which is also why I tell teachers, the minute you throw a kid out of your classroom and send them to the principal's office, you've made the problem worse, because now your classroom is dangerous, right? And this is a place that a kid has been excluded or thrown out. They go down and they regulate in the principal's office and they get calm and they have a conversation where the principal's talking to them as opposed to talking to Harold and Bob. But they walk right back into a context that doesn't have conflict resolved. And then they escalate again. And then it just becomes this revolving door.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. It's so true. And that simple awareness alone can completely change the whole dynamic.
Yeah. Well, and if you'd give them the story of Harold and Bob, then if you're having a bad day, I could be like, Brooke, what is Harold telling you? As opposed to, what are you thinking? What's wrong? What's your problem? Because when we're out of control, the passengers that come along with feeling out of control are shame and guilt.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help us. And so then we start to, it's like it's just a, constant cycle. It's like, I don't feel like I'm in control. So now I'm nervous. I'm going to blow up. Now I'm going to blow up. And then I feel bad about myself. So all those folders in Harold's file just continue to get more and more negative.
Yeah. Yes. That's so true. Yeah. And I even just hearing you say it, those two different ways felt differently. It landed differently.
Yeah.
And it does really make a difference. It just takes the judgment out of it.
Right. And you could say, hey, Bob seems really agitated today. How can we help calm him down? Now I'm your helper, not your adversary.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you recommend that teachers kind of do check-ins, or like once they've introduced this concept in the classroom, how do they follow through with it?
So I think, once they have the contract, if they see kids that are getting stressed out, then, they can remind them, hey, try your strategies or whatever. The Fizzy or Flat keeps it forward every day for the kids. Yeah. And then the other thing I talk a lot about is that the solution to pollution, right? We have a lot of pollution in that sensory association toolkit that Harold uses, lots of negative associations. So we had the solution to that pollution is dilution. So how do we infuse positivity into the classroom? That's funny. There's a video of like research where they asked people to count how many baskets somebody made in a video. And then after the video's over, they ask the participants how many baskets, and they tell them. And then they say, did you see the giant gorilla that walked across the basketball court? And like most people don't see the gorilla. There is a giant hairy gorilla walking right there, and they don't even see it because their brain is primed to look for the baskets. Well, when Harold's priming us and when all those folders are priming us to look at the negative, that reality of the gorilla doesn't even pass through the filters. Harold doesn't even notice it. So I teach teachers to do just, have a question of the day. Or at the end of the class, just say, hey, turn to your neighbor and tell them 2 great things that have happened today. Or what's one thing you're proud of? Just priming that brain to start looking for positives. Because if the brain knows it needs to report out something positive every day, it will start to look for those and it will retain those. So they can do that. And the other thing I talk about, this has been so impactful and it's so easy to do, is break your class up into learning sprints. Because one of the other things, we think about safety and we think about emotional safety as really important for kids, but it's also intellectual safety. If I feel dumb or I feel like I can't keep up, then that starts to get me, into that danger zone. So the learning sprints, all you do is set a timer, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. And you tell the kids, okay, we're going to do a 10-minute learning sprint. Here's the expectations. I'm going to talk for a minute. So I need everybody to look at me and listen. And then you're going to have some time to work with a partner. So you can talk quietly while you're working with your partner, whatever the other stuff is. And then you put a visual timer up. So, and that's important. It has to be so that they can see it. And then at the end of that 10 or 15 minutes, then you take a brain break. And that brain break can be turn to your partner and just talk, or it can be a positive question, or it can be like for little ones, it could be like, okay, everybody stand up and we're going to do a loop around the room and you walk like your favorite animal, or let's all do the crab walk, or, you can, whatever, it can be teacher led. It can be very, free flowing. It can be take 5 minutes and just draw a picture. And our brain is not set up to maintain attention for 8 hours a day. And schools, when they went to that like bell to bell, and I talk about this in NeuroWell, bell to bell is a nightmare. Nobody can do bell to bell. Like you expect me to be totally focused and engaged for 47 minutes, and then I get 2 minutes, and then I have 47 minutes in a different, it doesn't even make sense with the brain. So if you break down into chunks, it's kind of like being on a treadmill. If you get on a treadmill and say, I'm going to run for a half hour, you start running and it's like you look down and you're like, oh my God, it's been 4 minutes. But if you break it down into little intervals, you'll make your 30 minutes. So they do that and then a brain break. And it's been amazing. I had a kindergarten teacher that said, I cannot believe it took like 3 days. And these kids are like, as soon as she says we're doing a learning sprint, they're all like, oh, and they sit up and they're ready to go. And they're like helping each other. And they're saying, you got so much done. And they're like, and then they take the break and then they get right back to work. So it's simple things like that. Like what I try to teach is this is not a new initiative. It's put on a new pair of glasses with brain knowledge in them. And all of a sudden, these things become really simple.
Yeah, incredible. And it is. It makes a lot of sense. And they sound manageable. They sound manageable for teachers. It doesn't.
And you don't need to do 3 days of professional learning to figure out how to do a learning sprint. And, and it works with any curriculum. So it's like, it's not one more thing you've got to figure out how to wedge into your day. It's just sort of spread throughout the day.
This show is brought to you by Therapeutic Approach to Growth. Therapeutic Approach to Growth helps families with relationship and behavioral needs. Their holistic programs are individualized to honor and respect each family and their autistic son or daughter's sense of self through programs such as relationship development intervention, naturalistic ABA, and animal-assisted services. If you're finding yourself frustrated or discouraged with your current behavioral programs and would like to see more long-term meaningful growth for you and your family, then contact TAG today at www.tagforgrowth, that's tagforgrowth.com, to learn more about how to schedule a consultation or how they can offer you the help your family needs, whether in person, remotely, or in a school setting. Again, that's www.tagforgrowth.com.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I love that you were talking about the self-awareness piece. And I know when we spoke before, you had mentioned that that comes first before self-regulation. Let's talk about why that happens, why it's so important to start with self-awareness. We do that a lot in our work as RDI consultants too. And so I'd love to have you share more from that lens.
Yeah, I think, for a couple reasons. One is that if you don't have self-awareness of even how your body feels when you're starting to get stressed, or some of those messages that you start to hear from Harold, if you don't have that, then you escalate beyond the point where your CEO is still operating. And so that self-awareness can be helpful just to like calm you down before it gets too bad. It can also help you be proactive. So like, for example, I use the example of I don't like being late. I leave early because I know that even though now that I've basically told Harold, like, knock it off, this is not that, we're good.
Yeah.
But it still makes me very uncomfortable to be late. I was 5 minutes early getting on here, right? And so I do that because I know that then I can be relaxed. So having some of that self-awareness gives you the power to control your own context instead of always feeling like you're a sort of victim to whatever's happening around you.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yep. And then you can learn to self-advocate, right? Because you understand yourself.
Right. Well, and the other thing too about self-awareness is I get called in to work with some, kids that are really struggling. And so I do a lot of like behavior kind of work. And if we want kids to adopt a new behavior, the current behavior plans we use do not work. And most people, they might work for a week, but they don't actually change behavior, because they're really, a lot of them, the ones I see, are about control and compliance.
Yeah.
It's like, you have to sit in your seat. And then, did you sit in your seat? So
Right.
it's looking at outcome data. It's not looking at the efforts I have to make to be in self-control.
Yeah.
So if we want to change a behavior, the first thing we have to do is recognize where to go instead of the current behavior. So like if you and I said, we're going to get fit and, we're going to eat better. Maybe we go out to a Mexican restaurant 3 times a week and we chug margaritas and eat chips and, it's bad for us. So we say, okay, we're going to be healthier. We're going to go to Golden Corral. That's not the appropriate replacement behavior, right? We should be going to the vegetable restaurant. We assume that kids know what they should be doing and are choosing not to do it. But a lot of times they don't know what to do. And especially if the behavior is not them, where their character lives, if it's Harold and Bob trying to protect them, they don't know what to do. So the first step is really giving them a replacement behavior. But the second step is they have to have the self-awareness to drive past the habit and get off at the next exit where the new behavior is. And then they have to have energy. And how do we get energy? We get energy through positivity, through encouragement. So, you think about, if you and I are tired one week, we're going to be like, ugh, I don't want to go there and have to try something new. Let's just, go back to the place that we're comfortable with. Because you also have to have the will to be uncomfortable. So I see a lot of times that behavior plans are more about like, stop doing that, and I'm going to count how successful you were, but they don't really have any action plan in them or agency for the student.
Yeah.
So I always try to design them like when then plans. Like if they're stress induced behaviors, or if they're attention seeking behaviors, it's when I need attention, then what do I do? And we put something visual in. Like I use with kids who are super impulsive in their behavior. When I want to do something impulsive, then what I'm going to do is do this, stop and think. And you do, make jazz hands and say stop and think in your head. And what that does is it gives you that split second to make a choice, but it also gives your teacher something visual. So I can walk over and be like, what did you just stop yourself from doing? And, it can be like, well, I was going to throw this chair. And I'm like, but you didn't. High five. So I'm giving him a dopamine positive reinforcement for the efforts he's making to use the replacement behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And it's so empowering. The child, can really.
They have control.
Yes.
Yeah. Because a lot of the behavior plans I read, it's like, I did everything the teacher told me.
Yeah.
I sat in my seat. It's all about like the restriction of doing something. Right. This is about you having the power and agency to do it. And then we're going to celebrate it. And, I always ask people, say a kid has real major impulse control issues and they get in trouble 3 times in one day, but they have 100 times that they did stop and think.
Yeah.
That's a success.
Yeah.
And maybe another day they just were tired and weren't feeling it. and maybe they only had one outburst, but they only had to stop themselves twice. To me, that day is the failure because they weren't, you know, weren't triggered to do it. And so, but we would look at the day that they have more explosions as the bad day.
Yeah. 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 It makes so much sense. And I think it's like what to me stands out is that it's helping them to identify as somebody that's successful and capable.
Yeah.
And that they're doing it for themselves, their own success, as opposed to just for an adult's, affirmation. That's what's expected of them.
Well, and the other piece that I always do in any behavior plan is I have a self-assessment. The student gets to assess themselves first.
Yeah.
So maybe at the end of the class period or the end of the day, they get to assess, how did you do today? And then the teacher can say, I agree with you, or, I'm so sorry, I didn't see that. I didn't realize that you had done that so many times. It gives them an opportunity to give them some positivity. Or they might say, that's not the day that I saw. So they can, but it gives the child a chance to, because at the end of the day, we change habits because we want to, not because somebody, it's one of those, you don't speed when a cop's sitting there, but a lot of us speed when they aren't, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not an internalized. So I always try to add that in, that the kid gets to do some self-assessment as well.
Yeah, that's empowering. And I mean, ideally they take that outside the classroom then and start to assess in other environments too. It's a life skill.
Yeah. And the thing that is really interesting is that what people who've been using the way that I structure a behavior plan, you don't have to, because I feel like a lot of behavior plans are just like, hit the button and you get a prize.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, if you do this, if you're good, you get points, or you get, the token economies and the toys and the snacks and all this other stuff. But when you have extrinsic rewards like that, it can be helpful to have some type of an extrinsic reward when we're learning a new behavior. If we went on a weight loss kick and we said, if we lose 10 pounds, we'll go get pants, that might be enough to keep me motivated to stay self-aware.
Yeah.
But once you start actually internalizing, hey, I feel good about this, and when you're getting a lot of positivity, you don't need all that stuff. And in fact, extrinsic rewards will demotivate you from continuing that behavior. Eventually I'll be like, I don't need any more pants. So that's not motivating to me anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and eat the sundae.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's so important. That's a huge part of, the autism field. There are a lot of external rewards used, and we in our work as RDI consultants, we really try to stay away from external rewards unless it's really, really necessary, because it's just not needed. They can be internally motivated, and then it's more powerful, and then they get to feel good about themselves as opposed to just like, well, I just wanted that treat or, that toy.
Well, the best reward of all is pride and self-control, right? Feeling like I got this and feeling happy and good. And so if you need to give somebody a little bit of extra motivation, like, hey, if you're good for the week, I'll take you out for ice cream, or, whatever, you can start with those prizes. But I just see the whole system is built on these kinds of, candies and tchotchkes, and it's an expensive and not very effective system for actually changing behavior.
Yeah. No, 100%. I think that's fantastic that you're making those recommendations and helping professionals be able to see that it can be done without that. And now I know when we talked before, you mentioned these 7 conditions for lasting behavior change. Let's go through those. What are they and why are they important?
Yep. So those were what I was talking about with the you and I want to go to a different restaurant. So the first one is you got to know where to go instead. So you have to know your replacement behavior you want. The second is you have to have self-awareness so that when you start to veer off on the old habit, that you have a stop and think of some way to say, hey, and sometimes that can be, I have my goal on a sticky note right in my mirror. And so every morning, right there it is, and I know what it is. Or if I'm at school, I have it on my notebook. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep track of it.
Yeah.
The second thing is you have to have the will to be uncomfortable, because even if you know that your behavior is taking you somewhere that's going to end up being bad, that it's comfortable. So from a Harold and Bob perspective, they're like, we've been down this road before. There's no need to panic because we know what will happen. And then you need to have the energy, and the energy is through positivity, through those dopamine hits of like, hey, look at what you did. Look how good you're doing. Self-assessment, pride, parent engagement, get everybody involved in cheerleading that change.
Yeah.
Then you have to have persistence, because it takes time and effort to do this change and to actually build automaticity in your neural connections. Then you have to have tenacity to forgive yourself. And this is a huge one, because you and I will end up at the restaurant again eating chips some night, right? But here's what most Americans do, adults and children, is you and I'd be like, well, that was fun trying that vegetable thing, but we're not meant to be healthy eaters, so I'll see you here next week, right? It's easier to fall back into that habit and say, I'm not good enough, or I'm not driven enough, or whatever.
Yeah.
What we want to say is, okay, we fell off and that was fun, but like, we are committed, we are doing this. So we're going to go to the, vegetable restaurant next time. So we need to have forgiveness. And that's where the plans that are like tattletale gotcha plans are not building that sense of tenacity in forgiving yourself when you go back to old habits.
Yeah.
And then the last one is support. Let's do it together, or I'm proud of you, or let me set you up with another friend to do, whatever.
Yeah.
So I'll even, when I work with PBIS systems, I tell teachers, have your kids look at your PBIS, look at the behaviors, and first of all, make sure that your PBIS matrix is not about class rules and compliance, right? I've seen so many places where they've just taken class rules and dumped them into boxes and labeled them as respect or safe or whatever. We want to be doing like positive behavior support, like how do we grow people into be altruistic, kind, those kinds of things. So once they list like what are some examples of what this behavior looks like in practice, then they have them set one goal. So they say, okay, we're not all good at everything. So you pick one of these areas that you want to focus on for the next couple of weeks. If I give you 13 goals, you're never going to achieve. You're going to be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
When you've got kids who come who have low emotional regulation or impulse control, or, low reasoning skills, executive function skills, and then you say, here's 42 things that you have to do every day. And then they just,
Right.
So they pick one goal, and then you put them in groups, and you have peer groups. And then maybe once a week you take 2 or 3 minutes and you say, okay, you have self-assessment, your peers can catch you being good, and then the teacher. So lots of opportunities for reinforcements. And then maybe once a week you sit down and you say, hey, how are you doing this? You did a great job this week. So like I had a kid at high school that always forgot his stuff at home, like terrible about finding his belongings. And so he was sitting in a group with another group of kids who all lose their stuff.
Yeah.
And he said, I finally realized if I put a sticky note on my steering wheel every day, that will remind him. Because he's like, if I put it in my bathroom in the morning, I forget about it by the time I do all the other things. But when I get in my car to drive to school and it's right there, I remember, oh, crap, I forgot that. And he would go back in. And the other kids are like, oh, that's genius. I could do that.
Yeah.
So they're learning from each other, and they're taking bite-sized chunks into developing their skills.
Yeah, that's so significant. And I think also that they're not alone, that they have that camaraderie that, you know what, we all have challenges.
Right.
We can share in those challenges and help one another.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think humor is great too. Add a little humor in it.
Yeah.
I mean, if the kid's having a bad day and does something, there have been times when I've been talking to a kid who's had a fight or whatever, and I'm like, man, Bob and Harold did you wrong today, huh? And they'll be like, I know. And I'm like, all right, well,
yeah,
what are we going to do about it? And then we make fun of Harold, and we, it's like we have a little bit of levity in it. It's all, your life is hard.
Yes. Yes, we need to have that for sure.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these hard things. These are hard things.
It's hard things. Yeah. And then, my third book kind of builds on the same thing. It's called Aspirations to Operations. And it's about leadership and leadership using brain science. Because the other problem that I see right now in schools is teachers are burned out. They're stressed. They're burnt out. They don't know what's expected of them. They're constantly saying, I can't do anything else. They're overwhelmed. And that's not good for kids. And it's not good for the culture of the school or anything that goes along with being NeuroWell.
Yeah.
So that book goes through and provides an 8C framework for leaders that really thinks about, okay, do we have culture? Do we have clarity? Do we have coherence? There's 8 different C's, and it's basically how to develop an implementation strategy based on the brain science, because it's not just kids that have brains.
Yeah.
Our brains work the same way. And we all have a Harold and Bob, even if you're 70 years old.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, let's talk about that and kind of some of the recommendations you have and from the leadership perspective.
Yeah. Well, the first and most important is that we have got to have a context, because remember, it's biology and context that influences our behavior. We have to have a context where people feel a sense of belonging. And so if you've ever walked into a meeting and you look around and you're like, oh, these are not my people, you shut down and you sort of disengage. But if you walk in and you're like, these are my people, then there you are. And social scientists have actually studied this. They call it collective identity. And they studied it in the military, and they said, how is it that people from wildly different walks of life form these really strong ties together? And what they realized was that when they are in that context, and because they're together for so much, that context, we are soldiers first. And then we're all these other things that make us different. Yeah. And we need a school where when you walk in, you belong. Like we are, and like some schools like Ohio State does a great job with this. People wear Ohio State gear. They want to be part of Buckeye Nation. They're fans. They're all these things because it means something to be part of that group. And if you're wearing Buckeye gear in Columbus on a Saturday, you automatically have people who will eye contact you, high five you, scream OH. So there's a sense of community. We do not have a good sense of community in schools. And in some cases, the collective identity is negative. It's this sucks. I hate this. This is dumb. So that is step one. But the problem I see with leaders is that they talk about culture in terms of words. We have these words that we spent 6 months arguing over what we were going to call our culture. But culture is not built through words. It's built on actions. Culture is a feeling built on what we do. And so really being strategic about building that kind of culture where everybody belongs, including the teachers. And then there's 3 planning C's. So as you're thinking about making changes and transforming schools, the first C is clarity. And it's amazing how many times I've been with superintendents or with strategic planning. And I had one school, I said, so what's your instructional model? And he said, oh, we're UDL, Universal Design for Learning. He said, we've done all this training. And I was like, okay. So I said, well, what do you see and hear when the teachers are like UDLing it out of the ballpark? None of the administrators could answer that. Then we went back to the teachers and they were like, oh yeah, is that pillar thing we did a few years ago? And the superintendent turned to his admin team and he's like, we spent like over $40,000 on that thing we did 3 years ago. He's like, what do you mean they don't even know what it is? Yeah. They didn't have any clarity of what does it look like? And kids need that as well in the classroom, like, what do you expect? So that's the first planning C. The second one is coherence. So in a school that I worked with that wanted to do personalized learning, they spent all this money on it. And then they bought curriculum that was direct instruction. They're not coherent. So now the teacher's going to fail no matter what they do. Yeah. And then the third is coherence and thinking about the biology of fear and change and how do we get people to change in those sort of 7 habits. Once you've planned your change, then you have to engage people. So there's coaching and collaboration. And then you have to sustain it. So there's communication and celebration, which we do a really poor job at in school, the celebration piece. And so how do we develop authentic celebration systems that are aligned directly to that clear vision of where we're headed? So the aspirations to operations goes through each of those C's. And at the end of each chapter, there's a chance for some stop and thinks and then it also has tools that they can use to operationalize each of the steps of the C framework.
Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, it makes so much sense. So when you hear about the culture in schools and how there can be toxicity and it's a whole nother kind of entity than most work environments. At least I've never worked in this environment, but having my sister work in the school environment and friends, and over the years, just seeing it, it's interesting how it has its own way. And why is that? I'm so fascinated. Why is that the case?
Well, and I think what's interesting about school culture is that while you are a team, whether it's a department team or it's a solo sport. In most cases, you go in and shut your door and it's just your kingdom. And this is one of the things I talk about for kids in NeuroWell is if I am a kid who every period of the day, it's like going to a different country with a different ruler, with different laws and different norms, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And, so we need to have some shared understandings of how we want our culture to be and how we want our classrooms to run, so that the students have consistency. Because I always say to teachers, can you imagine if every period of the day you had a different administrator with a different evaluation rubric coming in to observe you and rate your teaching?
Yeah.
You would be a nervous wreck all day. And you would just be trying to please whatever you're in. And it's a huge cognitive load.
Right.
But we do that in schools. And then you end up with these warring factions or a teacher that thinks that they do everything right because they've never seen anybody do anything else.
Yeah.
And then other teachers who, she thinks she knows it all. And then it just gets very, very toxic very fast. And when there's no clarity about what is it that we want to do and sort of a shared collective approach to it, then it leads to some real backstabbing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would love for you to share what you do, in your work. You've written these books, but you also offer the support for schools. So let's talk about that. What does that look like?
Yeah. So I do keynotes. If a school's interested, I'll come in and do a keynote, or I'll do workshops. So I'll come in and work with an administrative team kind of in the summer to help walk them through those C's. And then I usually take and I do training with teachers as well on how to build the NeuroWell culture. And then I usually take about 5 or 6 schools that truly want to make transformation. And I go deep with them, and I am there like every couple weeks. I mean, it's very embedded work. And usually it takes about 2 years for me to work myself out of a job where they're sustaining change. Because the first year is like the planning and getting to know the place and starting to sprinkle in and experiment with the teachers. The second year is where we really start to see some common practices and sustained practice. And by then we have a fully developed kind of celebration and monitoring system to make sure that what we want to see is happening.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. I mean, I just think about 2 years. That's a long time. I mean, it's not long in the long grand scheme of things, but it takes time to make these changes.
It does. It does. And I've had a lot of schools that'll have me come in and they're like, well, we just want you to come in for a couple PD days. Yeah. And then I'm like, okay. And I'm like, but it's not going to change if the administration is not clear and purposeful and intentional about making that change happen. And I've had a few of them that have called me in and been like, yeah, okay, so we did the training and nothing changed. So now we're ready. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So let's do it.
No,
but
it's worth the investment. It's worth it.
Yeah, it's worth the investment. And just even in the student growth academically and the behavior issues. I mean, right now in schools, some of the kids, I mean, it's a full-time job for 2 adults to chase some of these kids around that are struggling. And if we put better systems in place, now you've just freed up a full-time employee that can do something else.
For sure. Yes. And it just leads to so many other things down the road, successes. And when you're doing this, are you mostly doing this with public schools, or do you work with private schools as well?
All over. I've done private schools, charter schools, public schools.
Okay.
And then I've worked in the private sector with leaders who want to create, they want to see implementation actually stick. And, I think right now in education and outside of education, it's a good time for leaders to be thinking about this brain stuff, because with AI, and I talk about this in Aspirations to Operations, AI is coming in and people are overwhelmed and they're scared and they are on very uncertain terms. And so you're seeing a lot more mental health. It's costing companies billions of dollars in sick days and, mental health issues and conflict and lack of productivity and all of those things. Yeah. And I think we are in such a time of flux right now that really getting clearer on how you want to support your people is a great investment.
Yeah. 100%. I love it. Well, let's talk about how people can find you.
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a website, lisariegel.com. I have another website that's all education focused. That's EP, like Edward Paul Institute.net. But you can find both of those on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So yeah, if people are interested in having a conversation, just connect with me through LinkedIn, or you can reach me through my websites and we can set up a time.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for being here today. And I love everything you're doing. I think there's such a need for it. And I'm glad to get this information out there more. And just wanted to make sure you do work with anybody, or you're not just in your area, you work with schools outside of your area, right?
Yep. I was in Colorado. I'm in Colorado. Next week I'm in Virginia. I'm all over.
Yeah.
So yeah, not just Ohio.
Yeah. That's great. What a resource.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting me share a bit about my work. I just really feel very passionate that we can be happier and we can all be healthier and more successful. And I think it truly starts with self-awareness and understanding this brain science and re-engaging the human system.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing amazing things. So glad to get your information out there. So thank you so much. And I appreciate just hearing the way you think about things and the brain and the way that you break it down in such a practical way. It was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. Have a great day.
You too.
I'm dancing on the edge again. The wind is calling my name. I'm dancing on the edge again. This time I'm not looking back there. You can change me, you can tell me down. I'll be back goes in every place I find. I'll break the molds with the rebels mind. I'm a hurricane of free born mind.
The information provided on this podcast is for general informational purposes only. The content shared is based on the experiences, opinions, and perspectives of the hosts and their guests and should not be construed as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment recommendations. The discussions and topics covered are intended to foster understanding and awareness of autism therapies, but are not a substitute for professional medical guidance. Before making any decisions regarding therapies or treatments, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified healthcare provider who can provide personalized recommendations based on your unique circumstances. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge and agree that the hosts, guests, and producers are not responsible for any consequences, damages, or outcomes arising from the use or application of any information during the show.